Hello, everyone. Welcome to the true story of Smoky the War Dog. I'm Marianne, an event planner with the library. Thank you so much for watching tonight's presentation presented by Adrienne Brigham. Adrienne will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so if you do have a question, please add that to the comments. For more upcoming library events, please visit ocls.info. Today, producer and professional public speaker Adrienne Brigham will be sharing the incredible true story of Smoky the War Dog. Adrienne has been presenting Smoky's story now for 9 years. Welcome, Adrienne. Thank you so much for sharing this incredible story with us. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for being here. It's a little muffled right now. Do you want to test out the sound again?
Uh,
There you go. Perfect.
that's better. Okay.
Yes.
I won't touch any dials then. Well,
Thank
uh, first of all, I love doing this story. It's a real passion of mine, and I would like to take credit for it, but it isn't my story. It's a true story about a gentleman named Bill Wynn and his dog Smokey from World War II, and how we got involved in this is actually part of the story now. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow, and I'll talk throughout it and give you the information I hope you need. And for me, this story all began on May 23rd, 2013. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself, just a little bit. I am by avocation an entertainment agent, and that probably sounds more impressive than it is. But I work with some stars in Hollywood, and I book concerts for them. I'm on the music side of the business. And I book concerts and get involved in recording sessions to some degree. But being an agent, that really means I just do 90% of the work for 10% of the pay. So it's not at all glamorous by any stretch. But on May 23rd, 2013, I was sitting at my desk here after dinner, and I was going through a contract and the contract writers. And I had my nightly martini in my hand, and I had the television on in the background. And there was a brand new television series that was just starting called Monumental Mysteries. And in that television show, Don Wildman, who was the host, travels around the world to various monuments, and he tells the story about who did what happened, and what caused a monument to be built. And they do about 6 stories per hour, about 10 minutes per story. And I kind of enjoy these history mystery shows, so I was kind of half paying attention to it. And the first story came on, and I didn't really have an interest in it. I'd forgotten even what it was now. The second story I remember only because it involved a man who climbed a mountain somewhere, and I can't climb past the first rung of a stepladder without getting woozy. So I turned the volume down. I had no interest in that whatsoever. But the third segment came on, and all of a sudden my eyes became glued to the screen. And I put down the contract, and I did something I never ever do, and that's put down my martini. And I just couldn't believe the story I was seeing unfold, seeing and hearing. And before the segment even ended, I was on the internet searching more information about the story. And I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that that night, that changed our lives, my wife and my life, forever, and in a very positive way. And that's the story I'm going to tell you now. And it all began in Papua New Guinea in 1944. And right where you see the head of that arrow, if you can see it, there was a dirt runway that was being used by the 26th Photo Reconnaissance Branch of the military. And they were flying reconnaissance flights over Biak Island, which is in the far northwest area of New Guinea, trying to retake that island from the Japanese. And one afternoon, a soldier by the name of Ed Downey had just, well, he delivered important papers and pictures to a nearby camp. And on his way back from the camp, he'd been told to hustle back because it was going to get dark and it could be pretty dangerous in the jungle at night. And as he was hustling through the jungle, the engine on the Jeep sputtered and stalled. And Ed got very frustrated. He got out of the Jeep and he opened the hood and he was trying to pull on wires, tug on things, just anything he could to try and get the Jeep restarted. And all of a sudden, off in the undergrowth, he heard a noise and it startled him. So he reached behind the front seat of his Jeep and he pulled out his rifle. And then he walked very cautiously over to where he could hear the noise coming from. And as he grew closer, it was behind a batch of brush. So as he pushed the brush aside, he then became very scared because he could see a foxhole. And the noise was coming from the foxhole. So Ed crept up very cautiously to the edge of the foxhole, raised his rifle up, and as he got right to the edge of the foxhole, ready to shoot, he suddenly stopped, looked down in the foxhole, and muttered, "A dog. A damn dog." A dog had fallen into the foxhole and was trapped. It couldn't get out. Well, Ed didn't really like animals too much, especially dogs. So he walked back to the Jeep and he continued working on the Jeep for a little while and finally got the engine restarted. And just as he was preparing to drive away, he heard a very sad kind of cry come from the foxhole. And his conscience got the better of him. So he climbed back out of the Jeep. He took a blanket that was in the back of the Jeep. He walked over to the foxhole and he pulled the dog out, wrapped the dog in the blanket, put the dog in the back of the Jeep, and returned to his camp, where he dropped the Jeep off at the motor pool, which was headed up by Sergeant Dare. And he was a little bit overdue at this point, so Sarge was asking him what happened, and Ed was trying to tell Sergeant Dare. And Sergeant Dare honestly thought the whole thing was kind of funny. And the more Ed told Dare what was going on, the harder Dare laughed. And finally, Ed looked at Dare and he said, "Fine." He said, "If that's the way you want to be, I brought you a present. It's in the back of the Jeep. I hope it does something nasty all over your tent." And then Ed left the Jeep and he walked back to his own tent, which he shared with Private Bill Wynn. And Ed was cleaning up after the kind of rough experience he had. And suddenly Bill came in the tent. And Bill was not happy. He was pretty angry. He had heard what had happened. And Bill said, Downy, what happened? What did you do with that dog you found in the jungle today? And Ed looked at Bill and he said, I gave her to Sergeant Dare. Why? And Bill was like, well, why didn't you bring her to me? You know I love dogs. I've wanted a dog ever since we got here. Why didn't you bring me that dog? And Ed just kind of laughed it off and he said, I don't want no mutt in my tent. And that was it. But Bill was very curious. So Bill walked over to the motor pool and he asked Sergeant Dare where the dog was. And Sergeant Dare pointed to a parachute that lay drying on the ground. And he said, she's under there. She crawled under there to get some sleep. So Bill got down on his hands and knees and he crawled over to the lump in the parachute. And finally, when he got to the lump, he peeled back the parachute and suddenly the dog's head popped out. And Bill was startled. He'd never seen anything like that. And Bill and the dog just stared at each other. And then the dog did something funny. She just leaned forward and licked Bill on the nose. And that was it. Bill fell in love instantly. And he looked at Sergeant Dare and he said, Sarge, he said, you know what? I've got 2 pounds. I'll give you 2 pounds for the dog. And they were dealing in Australian money, and 2 pounds was a little bit less than $6. And Sergeant Dare kind of laughed. He said, no. He said, I kind of like her. Plus, she's going to be my good luck charm in the poker game tonight. So that was it. There wasn't much more that Bill could do. But he went back to his tent, and he wrote his nightly letter to his fiancée, Margie, back in Cleveland, Ohio, and then went to sleep. The next morning, as Bill was getting ready to go to his darkroom, Sergeant Dare stuck his head inside Bill's tent, and he kind of sheepishly said, hey, Private, would you still be interested in buying that dog for 2 pounds? And Bill very suspiciously looked at Sergeant Dare and he said, why? What's the matter with her? And Sergeant Dare said, well, he says, there's nothing wrong with the dog, but she's not good luck. I lost all my money in the poker game last night and I need money to get back in tonight's game. So Bill quickly reached into his wallet and gave Dare the 2 pounds. And then he sat there looking at the dog that was to become Smoky. And he had to give her a name, so the black fur on her back reminded him of the smoke that came out of the smokestacks in his hometown of Cleveland. So he decided to call her Smoky. And right about that point, Downey came back in the tent and saw the dog. And he said, what's that dog doing here? I told you I don't want no mutts in my tent. And Bill looked at Downey and he said, she's mine. I bought her. You don't like it. You leave. And Downey just kind of scowled and he said, well, just keep her on your side of the tent then. And well, that's how Smoky really became Bill's dog. Now, they had other dogs in camp. Not a lot, but they had a few others. But those dogs were all owned by the military themselves. Smoky, having been found in an abandoned foxhole in the jungle, she didn't belong to anybody other than Bill, who bought her. So the first thing that Bill had to do was he had to train her. It could be kind of dangerous around there. So he started teaching her obedience commands. And Bill was actually an expert animal trainer. He and his family, or his mother and his brother, had grown up in the Depression. And they didn't have a lot of friends. they moved around quite often. Bill spent a lot of time in orphanage with his brother. And as I said, they didn't have too many friends, but Bill had always had a dog as a best friend and companion. And he was really an expert animal trainer. So Bill started to teach Smoky, and he found out that she was very smart. She learned her commands very quickly. So he thought, well, maybe he would then teach her some tricks that they could use to entertain the troops between their various missions. Where their base was at, it was not only for their own troops, but other troops were going to and from the front lines through their base. Plus, for a while, the 25th Photo Recon was also assigned to their area. So what they would do is they would put on little kind of mini USO shows for everyone. And Smokey and Bill became very popular entertainers at these little kind of USO type shows. And one day, Bill heard that Yank magazine, the official magazine of the military, was sponsoring a contest to name the best mascot of the South Pacific. So Bill entered Smoky, and they did a number of tricks. And one evening, when Bill was waiting to get on stage, he hadn't been feeling well that day, and he suddenly passed out. And when he woke up actually 3 days later, he was in a hospital in Nadzab, New Guinea. He had contracted dengue fever, which is something you don't want to get anywhere, anyplace, anytime, let alone in a jungle during the war. It's kind of like yellow fever or something like that, and it requires special hospitalization. So Bill was with other soldiers, but he felt very much alone in the hospital because his dog wasn't with him. And it turns out that afternoon, his buddies from his camp came to visit him. And they brought a copy of Yank magazine, and here's what the magazine looks like. And if you open the magazine up, you will see in the center there is a picture, an odd picture, but a picture of Smoky. She had just been named the #1 mascot of the South Pacific. And that was a great thrill to Bill, knowing that his dog was the best. And the nurses weren't too keen on having a dog in the hospital, but when they saw how much she calmed him down, how much joy she gave him, that they got the idea of maybe letting Smoky stay with Bill. So they went to the head of the hospital, Dr. Charles, and they asked Dr. Charles if it would be all right if Smoky stayed. And Dr. Charles came and saw, and he said, yeah, he said, it's all right, I'll let the dog stay, but only if she stays with Bill. I don't want her bothering any of the other patients. Well, that lasted about maybe 15, 20 minutes after Dr. Charles left. And then the nurses noticed that Smoky was affecting the other patients around Bill, but in a wonderful way. She was having a very peaceful, very calming, very entertaining atmosphere with them as well. And it got to the point that the nurses thought, well, maybe there's more we can do. They went back to Dr. Charles and they said, Doc, if you would let us, and if Bill will allow us, can we take Smoky on rounds to other wards and other rooms? We really think that she can help cheer patients up. So Dr. Charles agreed. And then when it came time to leave the hospital, all of the men in the hospital were begging for 10-day passes, so they didn't have to go back to the war right away. And they weren't giving any out. But Dr. Charles came to Bill and he said, you know what? He said, I will give you a 10-day pass if you do what I ask. I want you to fly to Australia tomorrow and go to the head nurses, or the nurses station in Brisbane, and find this nurse I know, and you do what she asks. And Bill said, sure, he'd be happy to do that. So the next day they flew, and actually it was kind of a dangerous flight. The weather was pretty bad, and they almost crashed. But Bill made it to Brisbane. He made it to the nurses station, found the nurse, and she said, oh, yes, she said, Private Wynne, she said, we've heard a great deal about you and your dog. She said, would you please bring your dog to the Royal Naval Hospital in Brisbane, where I'm the head nurse, and let us take her around to the patients in the hospital. Maybe she can do wonders for them as well. And then I guess another nurse said, well, I work at a different hospital. And pretty soon it got to the point where Bill spent his entire 10-day pass going from hospital to hospital, ward to ward, even room to room. But that was the wonderful effect that Smoky was having on the patients in all of the hospitals and all of the wards. It was really quite amazing. And when it was time for Smoky and Bill to leave, they stopped back at the nurses station and they picked up a coat that they had the nurses make for Smoky to wear to help keep her warm on the coldest nights in the jungle, because it could get pretty cold in the jungle at night. And when they got back to camp, it turns out that Dr. Charles had ordered a program be started to bring tame and trained dogs into the hospitals. And it's a program that grew in size. It came back to the United States after the war. And today it has grown into what we now call the therapy dog program. And I will tell you that my wife and I have a therapy dog. And the joy and the comfort and the happiness that these dogs bring to people who are sick, who are elderly, who have all kinds of medical problems. These dogs just do an amazing job. And we can thank Dr. Charles for that. And Dr. Charles, Bill didn't really realize it too much time, but it turns out that Dr. Charles had a last name, a rather famous last name. And Dr. Charles's father and uncle, if I have the story correct, were actually the Mayos from the Mayo Clinic. And they are the ones that founded the Mayo, and this was Dr. Charles Mayo. So Bill had a brush with a very famous surgeon. Now, when Bill was back in camp, at this point, their job of flying reconnaissance over Biak Island was all finished. And now it was time for the ships to load up and to sail north to retake the Philippines. And Bill was told to pack everything up. He would be on the second of two convoys of ships. Each of the convoys would be over 1,000 ships. Excuse me, I haven't had my martini yet tonight. And the first convoy was basically all Army and Marines. The second convoy were more Army and Marines, but carried all of their supplies, and in this case, Bill's photographic equipment, even the airplanes. And they would sail north, and they were told at the time when they set sail, when they left port, they were assigned to a compartment in their ship, And that's where they were supposed to go and sleep at night, in this compartment. And when, not if, but when they came under attack, they were to go below decks and go into their compartment and seal the doors shut. And that way, if a ship was hit, hopefully only a portion of the ship would flood. But they didn't think too much about that. It was basically a pretty boring trip. Really, all they had to do was sit and play cards all day. You have to realize this was 1945 or 44, I'm sorry. And of course, there was no radio, no television, no internet, no nothing other than just time to play cards. So that's what they were doing when one day the alarms went off. So Bill and Smoky headed down the deck, down the stairs, and into the compartment they were assigned to. The door was sealed behind them, and now he said it was just like pure hell in there. He said it was dark, the compartment stunk something awful, it was dirty, and he said now the noise, the tremendous pounding of the guns on deck overhead just made it unbearable. And he said about 15 minutes went by and the all clear was given. So he and Smoky were the first ones out the door, and they raced up the stairs onto the deck, and he looked around trying to see what he could see, but all he could see was black smoke rising in the distance, nothing nearby where he was or his ship was. So he went back to the card game, and again they sat down and just played cards for about another half an hour. And then the alarms went off again. A second wave was coming in. So again they dropped their cards, they ran down the deck, down the stairs, and into the compartments. Except this time Bill and Smoky got to the compartment too late. And actually Bill didn't really want to be in the compartment anyway. So the door had already been sealed shut. He turned around and he walked back up the stairs. And right when he got to the top of the stairs, he said it suddenly went quiet for just a moment. And he heard a loud cheer go up. And as he got to the top of the stairs, he saw an enemy plane spiraling into the sea that they had hit. But then the guns started up again. So he and Smoky made their way back up to the bow of the ship. And actually, they had been sleeping in the bow. They hadn't even been in their compartment overnight. It was too hot and humid for them. But Bill got to the bow of the ship, and he said just as he did, an enemy plane flew by the bow so closely he could see the pilot's face. And he said the plane made a direct hit on a ship about a half mile off their starboard side. And he said the heat and the pressure from the explosion, he could feel it a half mile away. And he said a destroyer came alongside to lend fire control, but he said his ship didn't stop. None of the other ships stopped. They were told not to stop if any other ships were hit. You just make yourself a target. So he said he learned later on that over 150 men were killed in that explosion. But even now, he didn't really have time to stop and think about any of this. The war was going on right around him. Bullets were flying. And this is a picture that Bill took. And what you see in the center of your screen, a large round tube, that's an air vent for the decks below. And just to the left of the air vent, you can see one of the anti-aircraft guns. And down on the lower right corner, you see the letter B. And that was the front tire of the Jeep that he and Smoky had been sleeping under to try and stay cool at night. And he said as he stood there, Smoky started to spin and bark. So he dove down on the deck to protect her. And as he did so, there was a loud explosion over his head, and hot metal rained down on him. And right where you see the letter a shell came in and landed right where Bill had been standing. If he hadn't dropped down on the deck to protect Smoky, he would have been cut in half and killed by that shell. So, in a sense, Smoky saved his life. And Bill would say that, fortunately, that was the only time that their ship came under direct attack. And they made it all the way to the Philippines and to the northern island of Luzon. And if you see Luzon Island, you'll see on the left-hand side there is kind of an indentation in the shoreline, and that is Lipsong Bay. And here is a picture today from Google Earth of Lipsong Bay, and you can see where the 26th Photo Recon was located. They took over an airfield that was actually used by the Japanese. And that airfield still exists today, except now it's been paved over and modernized. Back then, it was just, again, a dirt runway. But they were going to be using that airfield for reconnaissance flights now over the rest of the Philippines and over the islands north. And now they were not going to be flying in the F-4s as much as they had been before. Now they were flying in Catalina PBYs because the Catalinas could double as search and rescue planes. And they worked very well for that, and they could fly like 24 hours at a time. The only problem with the Catalinas was they were so slow, they were easy targets for the Japanese. So it was a pretty dangerous mission to be assigned for reconnaissance duty on the Catalinas. But again, that was part of the war. They didn't think anything of it. And as Bill was working in his darkroom one morning, the officer in charge of communications at his airbase came in and sat down and just started talking, and he was making small talk. And nothing very special, but he kept staring at Smoky. And finally, the officer looked at Bill and he said, "Private," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you. We have a very big problem." When the engineers came in and reinforced the runway with metal grates to hold the weight of the American planes, which were much heavier than the Japanese, they didn't take the time necessary to run communication cables that we desperately need underneath the runway to a Marine unit nearby. And the flyers, these guys really weren't equipped to defend themselves. That wasn't their job. They would have to rely on the Marines if they were attacked, and they were being sniped at and shot at quite frequently. And the officer said, "We desperately need those communication cables run. The problem is we'd have to take about 300 men and probably 3 days of time to dig up the runway to run those cables." And they say they were taking sniper fire. He said, it's going to be dangerous. We're going to lose some men doing this. He said, "But we have an idea. Partway down the runway, there is a tunnel, drainage tunnel that runs underneath it. And we can't see through it. It's not very big and we can't see through it. But what we can see, it's half filled in with dirt and who knows what else. But we are wondering if your dog is supposed to be pretty smart. If you could get your dog to walk through that tunnel with a string attached to her collar, we could then use that string to pull our communication cables through there and thereby saving a lot of lives." Well, Bill wasn't too keen on the idea, but he finally agreed, and they took Smoky over to the tunnel, and Bill ran to the far end of the tunnel, got down on his hands and knees, and started to call Smoky to come to him. And his friends tied the string on Smoky's collar, and they pushed her into the tunnel. Twice, she got scared, and she backed out. But the third time, hearing her master's voice, she went ahead and walked into the tunnel. But she could only walk a few feet before the dirt and the mud was too thick. And then she had to get down and crawl. And pretty soon she disappeared from sight. And all they knew was at that point, as long as the string kept feeding into the tunnel, she was all right. They took measurements later on, and she got about halfway through that tunnel when the string stopped moving. And then everybody started to panic. And Bill was crying frantically, "Smokes, Smokes, come to me, Smokes, come." And all of the men and women at the base had their fingers crossed. And he said, finally the string started to move again. It was moving very slowly, but at least it was moving. Twice more, though, it stopped, and they had to wait. And finally, after what Bill said, it seemed like an eternity, he could see the glow of Smoky's eyes about 12 or 15 feet from his end of the tunnel. And as she grew closer to him, he realized what was happening. There was so much dirt and debris in the tunnel that she was literally having to pull herself forward with just her front claws. And she was so exhausted, she would have to stop to regain enough strength to go a few more feet. But he said that finally, when she got about 5 feet from his end of the tunnel, there was finally enough room for her to stand up. And he said then she kind of burst from the tunnel, ran out, and jumped into his arms with the string still attached. And a big cheer went up, and everybody applauded. And a couple of the men came and took Smoky from Bill, and they picked her up and they held her high over their heads. And they carried her around camp as a hero. And that night, I can tell you that Smoky didn't get her normal Spam rations. That night she got a steak for dinner. And it was quite a long time afterwards, but Smoky received the U.S. Medal of Honor for Animals for her gallantry in pulling that string through that cable or through that tunnel and saving all of those lives. The official war dog hero. Now, when they were finished in Luzon, they were assigned to go north to Okinawa. And Okinawa would be the last stop before they invaded Japan. And Bill's unit took over, again, another captured air base on the peninsula off of the northern end of Okinawa. And he said there they were all preparing for the invasion. And he said not only his unit, but he said the Navy had thousands of ships surrounding Okinawa at anchor. And they were preparing for what would be the bloodiest part of the war. The Japanese had sworn that they would fight every last man, woman, and child. And there was nothing that could be done other than just go through it. But Bill said one morning, when he was working in his darkroom, he heard a loud cheer go up. He didn't know what it was, so he went outside the darkroom. And on the front door of the mess hall, across the common area of the camp, there was a crowd of people, and they were cheering at something posted on the mess hall door. So Bill went over to see what it was, And this was the picture he saw. The first atomic bomb had just been dropped. And they hoped and prayed now that maybe the Japanese would finally surrender rather than force an invasion. And of course, just days later, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and the Japanese did surrender. And the war was effectively over. And now all Bill had to do, as well as the other soldiers, was pack up everything that they had built and brought to Okinawa, put it on the ships to be transported home, and then they could be sent back home as well. But it doesn't just happen overnight. It takes weeks, months worth of work to do that. And finally, one day, Bill's commanding officer came to him and said, Bill, Private, he said, your job is finished now. He said, there's a ship leaving Okinawa tomorrow for Korea. And you take that ship to Korea where everyone is staging to come back to the U.S. And Bill looked at the officer and said, you know what? I remember that pleasure cruise we had up from the islands down south. He said, I don't really want to go on a ship again. He said, there's a transport plane coming through in a couple of days. I'll just wait and catch the transport plane. And the officer said, suit yourself. So the next day, the ship that was leaving left Okinawa in a hurry. And the reason was that a major typhoon had changed direction in the Pacific and was now heading straight for Okinawa. And there wasn't anything they can do about it except prepare for it. So Bill and his bunkmate at that point, they crawled on the roof of their little hut and they put large stones and bricks and anything heavy they could find on it to try to hold the roof on it. And that night they tried to get some sleep when about, I think it was 7 or 7:30, there was a loud bang and the roof came off their bunkhouse. And he said he'd been sleeping on his cot with Smoky tied to a rung of the cot. So he picked the cot up and he decided to run across a field to another building which was reinforced for typhoons. And he only made it a few steps out the door when a gust of wind came along, grabbed the cot and tore it out of his arms and sent it sailing in the air like a kite, with Smoky still tied to it. And Bill chased that cot across the field, finally was able to get another hand on it. And as he pulled it back down, he said Smoky was scuffed up and bumped up, but he said nothing was broken. So they made it to this other building, and he said the other building wasn't that well reinforced. All it had was a reinforced roof, but it had no walls. So the wind and the rain and the cold came right through the sides. And that's where they spent the next 12 to 15 hours of Typhoon Louise. And he said it was, at that point, a top secret until after the war. But Typhoon Louise was the strongest typhoon ever to hit the islands in the Pacific up until that period of time. And it was, as I said, a top secret. The U.S. Navy lost more ships from Typhoon Louise, ships that were moored around the island, than they did in the entire rest of the war combined. Almost 300 ships were sunk or beached. And I know a few years ago I was giving this talk at a senior home in Barrington, Illinois, and and a man in the back of the room waved his hand, and he said, "I know." He said, "I was on one of those ships." He said, "Typhoon Louise broke my ship in half, and we had to swim to shore to survive." So the fact that Bill and Smoky survived Typhoon Louise was quite an accomplishment. And I can tell you that a few days later, when that transport plane came through, they were on it. And they flew to Korea. And now it was just a matter of waiting time, waiting their turn to board the ships to come back to the U.S. And now it was time for awards to be given out. Bill was raised to the rank of corporal, and Smoky was also given the honorary rank of corporal. And her patch, corporal patch, was sewn on her coat that the nurses had made for her, along with other patches and medals. And this is what the coat looks like today. It's a very beautiful coat. I've seen it in person. And now all I had to do was just wait. And finally they were told a ship was ready for them. But the U.S. Army ordered that no mascots, no animals of any kind would be allowed on board the ships to come back to the U.S. There wasn't room for them on board the ships. There wasn't food for them on board the ships. And most of all, the Army feared that an animal might bring disease on board. So Bill would have to leave Smoky behind. And even though he protested and said, "She's just not an ordinary dog. She was the best mascot. She's a Medal of Honor winner," it didn't make a difference. So Bill did all that he could do. He smuggled Smoky on board with some friends in an old crate that had been used to carry oxygen containers. And he said that for the first 3 days of their trip home, he was so seasick he couldn't get out of bed. And he said finally, the third day, he was getting around a little bit when a first mate from the ship came down looking for something and discovered Smoky. And Bill and Smoky were immediately summoned to the captain's quarters. And Bill said when he got to the captain's quarters, he said the captain was just sitting in a chair in the corner. The two officers in charge of the Army on board the ship were waiting for him, and they reamed him out from one end of the ship to the other. And they threatened him. It had been at least told, or by different people, that animals would be thrown overboard if the provisions hadn't been made. And they were told that, or Bill was told that he would have to put up a huge sum of money to bring Smoky safely back to the States. And he promised that he would do that, even though he didn't have that kind of money. But they made it back to the States finally. And Bill said that when he got back to port, he said he was all prepared to go in and plead his case that he didn't have the money that he promised. But he said when they left the gangplank of the ship, he said nobody stopped them. He said they were just sent on their way to the bands playing to eat a nice dinner at the barracks and then get on the trains and go back home. Their stint in the war was over. So Bill did that. He went back home to his home in Cleveland. And he said he told his mother and brother that he was coming home. But he didn't bother to tell his fiancée, Margie. Instead, what he did was he walked up to Margie's house, climbed the stairs on the porch, and he opened the door to the front living room just a little bit, and he stuck Smoky inside the door and then closed the door. And he waited. And he said about 20 seconds or whatever went by, and all of a sudden he heard a loud scream. And Margie knew then that Smoky and Bill were back from the war safely. And she came running out, embraced him, and not long afterwards, they were married and started their life together. The problem was that Bill didn't have a job. So he had met a gentleman, another soldier on board the ship, who was a professional animal trainer in Hollywood before the war. And the animal trainer offered Bill a job as a trainer because he knew and saw how smart Bill was with training animals. So Bill got his best man to drive him and Margie across country in an old Packard that they bought because Bill couldn't drive stick shift. And they went to Hollywood. They went to work for one of the studios. And Bill said it was kind of fun work. It just wasn't steady work. And he said Margie missed home. Bill said he did train one of the dogs that was used by Ronald Reagan in one of Reagan's movies. But Margie wanted to go back home, and she wasn't feeling well anyway. So finally, after a few months, they headed back to Cleveland. And the reason that she wasn't feeling well is that Margie was pregnant with the first of their children. And I will tell you now that Bill and Margie actually had 9 children altogether. It's a wonderful story in and of itself. And so Bill went back and he got a job working for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which later on became NASA. And he flew on he flew on training missions around the U.S. where they were testing early de-icing equipment for the planes. And finally, when he left that job, he went to work as a photographer for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, where he became an award-winning photographer. And Smoky, well, Smoky just did what she knew best all along. She went back to becoming an entertainer. She would perform, they would do parades and things like that. Whenever Bill flew anywhere on training missions, Smoky would fly with them, and they would put on shows for the men and the women at the air bases. And Smoky got a job as an early television entertainer. Bill and Smoky together did. And they once did a string of over 40 shows in a row without ever repeating a single trick. And she led quite an amazing life then as an entertainer until she grew too old. And finally, she passed very peacefully on a cold night in January of 1957 at the age of 14. But her list of accomplishments is just absolutely amazing. 12 combat missions, 8 battle stars, 2 presidential unit citations. She is considered one of the 5 greatest U.S. war dogs in history. The U.S. War Dog Medal of Honor, the first Australian War Dog Medal of Honor, the first official therapy dog of record, and the #1 mascot of the South Pacific. That's just an amazing list of accomplishments for anyone, let alone a dog. And as I say, that she passed on a Saturday night in January. The following morning, Bill and his family got up. They placed her body in an old ammunition crate, and they took it to a spot in the Rocky River Reservation of Ohio. And for those who don't know it, the city of Cleveland is completely surrounded by a state park. And the Rocky River is on the western edge of Cleveland. Beautiful wooded area. And they went to a spot that before the war, Bill and his now wife had a picnic, and they carved a heart in a tree with their initials in it. And they decided that that would be the spot where they would bury Smoky, because regardless of where they ever lived or moved to, it was a spot they could always go back to and visit. And they buried Smoky with a very military style funeral and went back home that afternoon. And you'd think now that the story would be over, but it wasn't. Uh, they were only home a short while when the phone rang, and there was a woman on the other end of the phone, and she had read Smoky's obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer that morning. And she identified herself as Grace. And she said, Mr. Wynn, she said, you don't know who I am, but Smoky was actually my dog. And Bill was like, okay, how do you know that? And she went on to tell him that she had been a nurse in Brisbane, Australia, and her fiance, who was an American lieutenant, had bought her a puppy for Christmas who was being kept for sale in the front window of a pharmacy. And she loved the puppy very much, and she named the puppy Christmas. And then they were transferred to Papua New Guinea. And one evening, they went to see a Joe E. Brown USO show. And Christmas got away from them in the crowd. And they never found Christmas again. They believe what happened was another soldier found Christmas, tried to take her back to camp with him. She got away from him, wandered the jungle, and fell into that foxhole. Well, that's a stretch, to say the least. But Bill knew for two reasons that Christmas probably was Smoky. Number one, he had dropped something during the holidays on the floor in his dark room. And as he went to pick it up, he said, "Oh, Christmas." And the dog got up and got very excited and ran around. But that didn't mean very much. But there was another reason why Bill knew that Christmas probably was Smoky. I'll tell you that in just a minute. And Smoky's legacy carried on after that. There would be many more newspaper stories, many more magazine stories written about her. Bill would go out and tell her stories at various organizations. And then I saw that story being told on Monumental Mysteries in 2013. And I can tell you that before the story ended, as I said, I was on the internet typing, and I found Bill Wynn's email address. I wrote to him right away, and he wrote back to me right away. And Bill and I struck up a friendship that lasted for years after that. And then something else had happened. In 2009 and 10, my company produced a major record here in Chicago. And it kind of set the world of adult standards music on fire when it came out. It went to number one in national radio airplay. It was a full orchestra, and it made a star out of the artist who the music was for. And one of the radio shows that it was being played on was hosted by a gentleman in Hollywood who was rather famous. And he asked the CEO of his record label to get in touch with me and asked me to fly to Hollywood. And I did that. And I can tell you that our company grew because of that. We now represent Well, we did represent the Cordettes. They've disbanded now, but a wonderful singing group. We represent this young gentleman, Ryan Hughes, who's a hot young singer out of Central Michigan. Dina Martin, who is Dean Martin's daughter, and the four preps. And we represented them up until a little over a year ago when one of the primary members passed away. And the four preps are just a wonderful organization. And the other gentleman who we represent, I think many of you would know. You've either seen his movies, heard his music, or now you've seen his television commercials hawking bathtubs on Fox News, and that's Mr. Pat Boone. And there's Pat in the center. And Pat offered to help us because Bill had told me that one of his dreams was that maybe one day a movie could be made about Smoky's story. It certainly has all of the attributes of it. So Pat put the staff of his record label to work helping us. And when I got back home, it was about 6 months that passed, and a big thick package arrived for me one day in the mail, and I opened it up, and it was the first script for a movie about Smoky and Bill. And I normally carry it with me. I can't show it here on the screen, but I usually show it to people because I tell people this first script was so bad we can show it to anybody because it's unusable. Well, we've since been through 2 other scripts, and we're still working on that project. There were other folks around Cleveland, though, at the time that said, well, they knew of Smoky as a hero dog. And they said, well, heroes deserve monuments. We need a monument for Smoky. Well, you just don't build one that easily. It takes time, it takes money, it takes space. So it's a pretty complicated affair. And in this case, it took almost 37 years. But finally, in the year 2000, a new park board was put together in Cleveland, and they agreed to build a section of park in the Rocky River as a dog park, and there is where they would allow space for Smoky's monument. And the money was raised. They found a sculptor, world-renowned sculptor, Susan Bahari, to create the statue of Smoky. And space was, as I say, allocated. And finally, on Veterans Day of 2005, Bill got up that morning and he put on his veteran's hat. He put on his shirt with all of his medals on it. And they drove to the safe deposit box where Smoky's coat is kept when it is not on loan to a museum. And that coat has been in museums around the world. And they drove to the new dog park. And there they were met by more fans, more friends, more press. And here's a picture of the section of the Rocky River Park, the way it looks today. And the only problem became one of, in order to dedicate the monument to Smoky, they needed to find her grave site so they could relocate her grave to the monument. And Bill and his family went back to the spot in the forest. In fact, they looked all over the forest for the tree that had that heart in it. And they couldn't find it. They searched high and low. And finally, one afternoon, one of Bill's daughters mentioned to a park ranger what they were trying to do. And he smiled and he said, "Come with me." And he took them to a spot in the forest where a tree had fallen down. And they rolled the tree over and there was the heart. So they found Smoky's gravesite, and her grave was relocated to the monument. And then, as I said, on Veterans Day 2005 came the dedication of the monument. And this time, they say they were met by many more people, and the Army sent an actual color guard to perform at the dedication of Smoky's monument. And they played taps for her. They gave her a 21 gun salute as a hero. And it's very lovely what they have done with that park since then. There's a tall flagpole that flies the flag for her 365 days a year. And there's a section in the monument area with chairs for people to sit and look. There's a large boulder with a plaque on it that is a dedication to all veterans of the wars. And finally, in the right next to the monument itself, there is a large color poster plaque with the names and pictures of the 5 greatest war dogs in U.S. history. And Smoky's picture is in the bottom right corner of that plaque. And I can tell you that I have been there a few times, and I still get choked up every time I see the monument. The monument stands about 4 feet high, and on top of the monument, there is a statue of Smoky. It's a little odd, but there's a statue of her. And I get all choked up and teary-eyed when I see it. You would expect a statue of a dog that was a great hero to look something like one of these. Perhaps Smoky standing at attention, perhaps sitting very nobly and proudly, or even running or leaping, something a great hero dog would do. But that isn't what Smoky's statue looks like. If you know Smoky's story, you will see the statue and appreciate it. But if you don't know Smoky's story, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, what the heck is that? Instead of a statue that looks something like one of these, you see Smoky sitting in a tub. And she's looking out over the side of the tub. And it's almost like she's smiling. And she just looks like she's the happiest dog in the world, waiting to get her bath. And you think, okay, that's kind of weird. But there's a good reason for that. When Susan created the statue of Smoky, she used that very odd picture of Smoky that was printed in Yank magazine. The picture when she was proclaimed the best mascot of the South Pacific. And well, I could show you what Smoky looked like, but instead I'll give you an example here of what Smoky looked like. Smoky was actually a 4-pound Yorkshire Terrier, like our little guy, Harry Potter. And Harry's going to be a stinker, not look at the screen. I guess maybe you didn't see that coming. And here's a picture of the real Smoky. And that was the picture that Smoky's statue was made from. there she is, the Yorkie Doodle Dandy, all 4 pounds of her. And there is the monument with the statue on top of it. And I can tell you that now the other reason that Bill thinks or thought he knew of Smoky's origin and why Grace's Christmas was indeed Smoky. At that time, in 1945, Yorkshire Terriers were so extremely rare outside of England. There weren't very many in the US. And there were only 4 Yorkies known to exist in Australia. And they were so expensive that the average Australian could never afford one. So if you had a Yorkie in Australia, you had to be someone very special. And a few years ago, a friend of mine who was kind of my counterpart in Australia, another very dear friend of Bill's, Nigel Alsop. Nigel did some research. He found a woman, and she remembered going to school with a young boy. And she remembered, of course, they were both very young at the time, but she remembered that that boy's family had a dog that had a puppy. And that puppy was being kept for sale in the front window of a pharmacy. And we believe that that puppy is the one that Grace's fiance found and gave to Grace that she named Christmas. We can't prove it, but we believe that that's the case. And who was this young boy? Well, here's a picture of him. His parents were General Douglas MacArthur and his wife. So we have reason to think that perhaps Smoky was indeed the puppy that was sired by the MacArthurs. And I can tell you on December 11th, 2015, my wife and I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning. We drove to Cleveland. We met Bill there, and we were there for the dedication of the Australian RSPCA Purple Cross for Smoky. And it was a wonderful celebration that day. A year later, Smoky was awarded the U.S. War Dogs Association Service Medal, which, according to our count, makes Smoky the most decorated dog in U.S. history. And here's a picture of Smoky's statue at the base of her monument with a number of her medals. And I will finish up here by letting Bill tell you in his own words a little bit about Smoky.
Her name was Smoky, her rank was corporal, and her serial number, well, let's just say during World War II, she was quite the canine. As you can see, Smoky had quite a few tricks up her sleeve. Tricks that her trainer Bill Wynn says gave hope to dozens of wounded World War II soldiers.
She was the first therapy dog on record. We were in Nansad with Guinea, and I was in the hospital with dengue fever. They were bringing wounded off of the Biak Island invasion, So the fellas brought Smoky to see me at the hospital, and they brought a copy of Yank magazine where she just appeared as the best mascot in the South Pacific. So the nurses saw this Yank magazine, and they saw this little dog, and they said to me, "Would you let Smoky go on rounds if we can get permission from our commanding officer to have her?" And I said, "Yes." 7 o'clock in the morning they came. She was gone all day till 9 o'clock at night. I don't know. They fed her, whatever she had to do, they took care of her. So I would like, in retrospect, have been with them just a few times to see how these guys reacted, because these are wounded. They're coming off of combat. Here's this little dog that's going through the war with them. I think that Smoky being there kind of turned things around a little bit, because she'd been a dog in the war with them, and she was novel in her size and what she was doing. They'd hear her story, and they'd watch her perform, and so it really had a whole different effect than your average therapy dog would, because you're dealing directly with the realities of life as it is going to be, and that's a very steep change for people.
Many times, the response to Smoky turned into heated debates among patients.
I was in Australia, and they were arguing over who's going to take her in the wheelchair to the next ward. They were wheeling around, going from ward to ward with me to hear the talk again and again, and each one wanted to carry the dog when they were going between wards.
And sometimes Smoky's effect was more profound than anyone could imagine.
They put me in the day room, and they had people coming in to hear my talk and show performance, so they could get the people I didn't go around the wards to. And they put a man in a wheelchair right up front. So as I started to talk and Smoky started to do a few things, he started to gurgle. This man did. And one of the nurses right away said, "Mr. Wynn, just stop a minute. Give him the dog. Give him the dog." So we handed her the dog, and he started, he held her up in the air, and he was gurgling and making all of these sounds and everything. He was just so thrilled. And I looked, and all the nurses were crying. I wondered what the heck's wrong, And he hadn't talked for 2 years. Showed no emotion. He had hardly moved. And yet, when he got a hold of the dog, that was his response.
In her time, Smoky did her share of helping soldiers, and today she is immortalized in a display at the University of Tennessee College of Veterinary Medicine.
The story is so unusual. This little tiny creature doing so much. However, the size didn't mean anything, because the ability of the dog to withstand all of the rigors of it was amazing. 4 pounds of dog in warfare is pretty remarkable. Again, we lived it day to day and didn't think that much of it. Her story has become legendary. She was a legend in her own time. The stories start coming out of the far Pacific about this little dog. She appeared in the New York Herald Tribune, where we were waiting for the war to end. She had a lot of spunk, and she showed it in a lot of ways.
And that is Smoky's story in Bill's own words. And I can tell you that sadly we lost Bill a little over 2 years ago at the sprightly age of 99. He was a wonderful friend, one of my best friends ever. And I have vowed to keep telling his story, and hopefully someday we can maybe get it made into a movie. But right now, you know the story of a very small portion of it. If you get a chance, at smokywardog.com, there are still copies of Yorkie Doodle Dandy, his memoir. They're still available on Amazon, I believe. And I hope you get a chance to read it, because I've only told you a small part of what they've been through and all that happened to them. But that's it. I'm going to open it up for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Adrian, so much for sharing Smoky's story with us. She might be the smallest little hero I've ever heard of. Absolutely adorable. I'm going to go ahead and share also, in case anyone wants to learn more about Harry Potter, I'm going to go ahead and share the website for their site in the comments. And that is harrypotter.com. So be sure to check that out. She has a really super cute Instagram that I follow, so it's adorable. Love all of her pictures and costumes. Be sure to check that out. If you have any questions for Adrian, you can put those in the comments. You can also check out our upcoming events at ocls.info. Share that too. I see a lot of awesome comments. Thank you. It's so cool. I'm learning a lot about the war dogs. Awesome. Thank you. We have a person that said that they love the model cars behind you, Adrian.
There are about 100 more beyond those.
Love that. Oh, love that. Oh, don't see any questions. We were like commenting during the event that if we were on that boat in the same position and we weren't allowed to take Smoky with us, we would have caused like a mutiny.
Yeah, it was a very difficult time for them, to say the least. So I'm glad they made the decisions the way they did. I'm going to hopefully exit the screen now.
Okay. I'll take that off.
There we go. How's that?
Yay, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Adrian, for sharing Smoky's story with us, and thank you so much for being here tonight. I don't see any other questions, so that will conclude tonight's event. Thank you so much again, and the replay will be available on OCL's videos as soon as we close out. So if you want to rewatch tonight's story of Smoky, the Incredible War Dog, you can check that out on OCLS videos. It'll also be on the OCLS Facebook page. Once again, thank you so much, Adrian, for being here tonight and for sharing that incredible story of Smoky the War Dog.
Thank you. I'm about an hour overdue for my martini.
Right. We'll be getting that right after we close out. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to find out when we have new fun and informative videos for you. Orange County Library System is your place to learn, grow, connect.